Empire Bay, 1943. Vittorio Vito Scaletta, a young man with dreams, debts, and a knack for trouble. A botched jewelry heist lands him a choice: prison or war. He chooses the battlefield, and it changes his life forever. But how did Vito's story begin? From his humble Sicilian roots to the gritty streets of Empire Bay, this is a tale of survival, betrayal, and the rise of a man entangled in the web of the Mafia. Stay tuned as we unravel Vito Scaletta's epic journey, from a street kid to a soldier, and beyond. On a rainy September night in 1951, Vito Scaletta sits alone in a crumbling apartment. A cigarette burns between his fingers as he flips through a photo album, memories flooding back. Born in 1925 in San Martino, Sicily, life was never easy for Vito. His family, Antonio Maria and his sister Francesca, scraped by, dreaming of something better. In 1932, Antonio made a bold choice. He moved the family across the ocean to America, chasing a brighter future. 7-year-old Vito was in awe of the bustling city of Empire Bay, but that wonder quickly faded when their new reality set in. A roach-infested apartment in the rough immigrant neighborhood of Sand Island. The American dream felt more like a cruel joke. Antonio found grueling work at the docks, but most of his wages disappeared into bottles of booze. Life didn't get easier for Vito, though he found a silver lining at school: Joe Barbaro. The two became inseparable, bonded by their shared poverty and knack for trouble. Petty crimes became their way of survival. In 1943, their luck ran out during a jewelry heist. Joe escaped, but Vito wasn't so lucky. Facing jail time, he was offered a choice: prison or the army. With America at war and needing Italian speakers for the invasion of Sicily, Vito chose the battlefield. Little did he know, the war would change him forever, and his return home would pull him deeper into a world he could never escape. The chaos of war was all around as Vito Scaletta parachuted into Sicily during Operation Husky. Assigned to the 504th Parachute Infantry, his mission took an immediate turn when flak struck their plane, forcing them to bail out behind enemy lines. Stranded but not alone, Vito, alongside a corporal and Private Williams, joined forces with the local resistance. Their first test came swiftly. Mussolini's soldiers descended on the small town of San Celeste, rounding up its people for execution. Vito and his squad struck back, liberating the town and storming the town hall to free the prisoners. Victory was short-lived. As reinforcements arrived, a shell from a German Vespe slammed into their position, leaving Vito unconscious. As Italian soldiers moved to finish the job, salvation came from an unexpected source. Don Calo, the powerful head of the Sicilian Mafia, arrived in a Sherman tank, flanked by his men. With calm authority, he convinced the enemy troops to surrender, offering them the chance to return to their families. The sight of the Don effortlessly wielding such influence left a lasting impression on Vito. It was his first encounter with the Mafia's true power. In that moment, amidst war's devastation, Vito witnessed how power and respect could turn the tide, planting seeds of ambition that would shape his future. After 2 grueling years away, Vito Scaletta steps off a train in Empire Bay, home on a month-long leave after being injured in battle. The familiar face of his best friend, Joe Barbaro, greets him with a warm welcome. They reminisce on the drive to Freddy's bar, Vito recounting his time in Sicily, a medal from General Patton, and the surreal influence of Don Calo. Over drinks, Joe reveals a plan to keep Vito home for good, arranging forged discharge papers through a trusted contact, Giuseppe. Later that evening, Vito returns to his family's modest apartment in Little Italy. His mother and sister Frankie greet him with tearful hugs and a warm meal. The next morning, the harsh realities of life come crashing in. Francesca reveals that their father left the family in debt to a ruthless loan shark. Determined to help, Vito promises to take care of it. Joe introduces Vito to a life of crime. Giuseppe teaches him to pick locks, and soon, Vito is stealing cars and meeting key figures like Mike Brewski, who buys stolen vehicles. Despite Vito's unease with the danger, he realizes there's no other way to make quick money and promises himself he'll take control of his future. Vito's return to Empire Bay isn't just a homecoming. It's the beginning of a new chapter, one where survival means walking a dangerous line between loyalty, ambition, and the harsh truths of the American dream. At his mother's urging, Vito Scaletta visits Derek Papalardo at the Southport docks to seek honest work. After a brief attempt at manual labor stacking crates, Vito realizes it isn't for him. When Derek learns of Vito's connection to Joe Barbaro, he tests his loyalty by having him collect a barber's fee from dock workers. The shakedown earns Vito an easy $100 and solidifies Derek's trust. Later at Freddy's bar, Joe introduces Vito to Henry Tomasino, a seasoned wise guy with a lucrative offer. The job: steal valuable gas stamps from the Office of Price Administration. Henry emphasizes the need for stealth. Any violence would cost Vito a significant cut. With the help of Maria Agnello, who provides details in exchange for a ride, Vito successfully pulls off the heist. However, there's a catch. The stamps expire the next day. Forced to hustle, Vito spends the night racing across Empire Bay, selling the stamps to gas stations before the deadline. Vito wakes up to a note from Joe instructing him to meet at Freddy's bar, armed and ready for a big job. Over drinks, Henry Tomasino explains the plan. A jewelry store owner owes money to Alberto Clemente and isn't paying fast enough. Vito and Joe are tasked with robbing the store after dark, disguised as phone company workers. That night, the duo successfully breaks into the store and begins gathering the jewels. Their plans unravel when Brian O'Neill and his gang crash through the storefront in a van, attempting to rob the store themselves. Chaos erupts as the two groups exchange fire, only for the police to arrive, forcing everyone to flee. Caught in the crossfire, Vito and Joe escape to the roof and cross to a neighboring building, narrowly avoiding capture. From their vantage point, they watch as O'Neill and his crew are arrested, leaving the jewels and trouble behind. At Freddy's bar, Vito meets Luca Guarino, who praises his previous work and offers a chance to advance in the Clemente crime family. The catch? Vito and Joe must pay a $5,000 initiation fee and prove their loyalty by eliminating Sidney Penn, a former associate who defied the family. Henry Tomasino lays out the plan: ambush Penn at his distillery using an MG-42. Vito picks up the weapon from Harry Marsden, a fellow World War II veteran, sharing war stories before heading to Sand Island. The ambush begins, but while Penn's men are gunned down, Penn escapes into the distillery. Vito, Joe, and Henry pursue him, fighting through the building until they corner Penn. Despite his pleas, they finish him off, but not before Henry is gravely wounded. As the distillery burns and police close in, Vito drives Henry to a mob doctor, El Greco, for emergency care. Grateful for Vito's help, Henry pays him $2,000. With his share, Vito finally clears his family's debt, reassuring his sister Francesca that everything is under control. Arrest and imprisonment. Leaving Joe's apartment, Vito Scaletta is arrested for distributing illegal gas stamps after being betrayed by a gas station attendant. Despite Clemente funding a lawyer, it's clear the lawyer's priority is ensuring Vito doesn't implicate the family. Convicted, Vito is sentenced to 10 years at Hartman Federal Penitentiary, life in prison. Arriving at Hartman on May 18, 1945, Vito is introduced to the brutal regime under Captain Terrence Stone. The reality of prison life hits hard, with inmates jeering and guards asserting dominance. After a scuffle with rival Brian O'Neill, Vito gains the attention of Leo Galante, a powerful inmate connected to the Mafia. Leo offers Vito protection in exchange for becoming a sparring partner and enforcer. Vito adapts to the harsh prison life through Leo's guidance. He trains as a fighter, learns mafia operations, and proves his strength by settling scores with the Irish inmates, culminating in a bloody confrontation with O'Neill. Despite the hardship, including the death of his mother, Vito survives by growing stronger and forging alliances. Released from prison early thanks to Leo Galante, Vito Scaletta returns to a city transformed. He feels out of place in a world that moved on without him. Vito's first stop is Joe Barbaro's, where Joe welcomes him warmly and gives him the keys to a new apartment in Uptown. After settling in, Vito reconnects with Joe, who introduces him to Eddie Scarpa, an underboss for the powerful Falcone crime family. Eddie, Joe, and Vito head to the Garden of Eden for drinks and women. During the outing, Eddie asks Vito why he chose a life of crime. Vito explains that he wanted more than his father's miserable life. Impressed by Vito's ambition, Eddie invites him to work for the Falcone family, which Vito eagerly accepts, the gruesome task. The night takes a dark turn when Eddie drunkenly reveals a secret. There's a body in the trunk of the car. The corpse belongs to Frankie Potts, who Eddie was supposed to bury, but postponed in favor of drinking. At Eddie's insistence, Vito drives them to the old observatory. With Eddie and Joe too drunk to handle the gruesome task, Vito reluctantly buries the body alone. After finishing the job, Vito drives the others back to Joe's apartment. Eddie promises to make it up to him, and Joe apologizes for the chaotic homecoming. Exhausted, Vito returns to his new apartment, reflecting on his first night back in the underworld. Vito Scaletta wakes to the sound of Joe Barbaro and a young accomplice, Marty, calling him downstairs. Joe has a truck full of stolen cigarettes and a plan to sell them around Empire Bay for easy cash. As Vito takes the wheel, the two discuss the chaotic events of the previous night. Vito, still shaken by burying a body, hopes for a smoother day. A greaser problem. Things take a turn when a gang of greasers, led by Billy Barnes, confront them and demand a cut for operating on their turf. Joe refuses, and chaos erupts as Barnes orders his crew to firebomb the truck. Joe retaliates by shooting Barnes, sending the others fleeing. Vito and Joe give chase, but the greasers manage to escape. Eddie's orders. Frustrated, the pair calls Eddie Scarpa for advice. Eddie instructs them to meet Steve Coyne at the Crazy Horse, a local bar, and make an example of the greasers, but without killing anyone to avoid bad press. The retaliation. Vito, Joe, Marty, and Steve head to the greasers' hangout at the Crazy Horse. When they find it empty, they trash the bar, shoot it up, and set it ablaze. They then move on to the greasers' hideout at an abandoned foundry. The showdown. At the foundry, the greasers are armed and ready, leading to an intense gunfight. Despite Eddie's orders, Vito and the others leave no survivors. Steve steals a hot rod as revenge, while Vito and Joe take two other cars to Derek's vehicle export racket at the docks, settling debts. With the cars sold, they make enough to pay Eddie the $2,000 they owe. Vito takes his share, reflecting on the violence and chaos of the day, and heads home for some much-needed rest. Vito Scaletta gets a call from Eddie Scarpa telling him to come to the Maltese Falcon with a gun and a decent car. When he arrives, he is introduced to Carlo Falcone, who asks Vito how he feels about Alberto Clemente and Luca Guarino. Vito states that the way he sees it, they tried to steal $5,000 from him and left him to rot in jail. Falcone goes on to say that it looks like they're about to make a move on him, so he's going to do something first. As Carlo leaves, Eddie explains that three of their guys, Harvey Beans, Epstein, the Falcone accountant, Frankie the Mick, and Antonio Balsamo all disappeared the night before, and the word around town was that Luca Guarino had something to do with it. He wants Vito to follow Luca, and if he finds out he had anything to do with this, he wants Vito to whack the bastard. Going after Luca. Vito follows Luca, who eventually leads him to the Clemente slaughterhouse, where Vito sees the men being unloaded from a truck. He works his way through the building until he finds where they're torturing the men for information on Falcone's drug operation. Frankie the Mick is already dead, and Luca's men are about to start on the other two, when Vito walks in and interrupts them. Surprised to see Vito again, Luca explains that if he knew what was really going on, he would realize he was better off in jail. Vito is suddenly hit from behind by Sammy, and the two fight it out for a while. Just as Sammy is about to hack him apart with a large meat cleaver, Tony Balls kicks a pistol over to Vito, and he shoots Sammy 3 times in the chest, killing him. When Luca sees this, he runs off to lock himself in an office and call backup, telling his men to take care of Vito. Luca's men were no match for Vito and Tony, and once they finished with them, they went after Luca, breaking down the door to his office and dragging him out. As Vito left to report back to Eddie, Tony went to work on Luca, supposedly torturing him with a cattle prod before throwing him in a meat grinder. After getting cleaned up, Vito meets Joe and Eddie back at the Maltese Falcon, where he learns that he and Joe are going to be brought into the Falcone family, becoming made men. Vito's old friend, Leo Galante, even stopped by to witness Vito's ceremony and wish him well. Vito finally felt like he had made it, that from here on out, his life would mean something. To celebrate, he goes out and buys himself a new house in Greenfield. The Falcone family declares war against Alberto Clemente after his brutal kidnapping and torture of their men. Vito Scaletta meets with Carlo Falcone, Eddie Scarpa, and Joe Barbaro to discuss their next move. Clemente is holding a meeting at the Empire Arms Hotel that afternoon, providing the perfect opportunity to eliminate him and his top associates. Joe unveils a small bomb meant to ensure precision, though it only deepens Vito's apprehension about the mission. Reluctant rolls. As they prepare, Vito notices Marty, a young and inexperienced driver, tagging along. Joe insists Marty's driving skills make him perfect for the job, though Vito remains uneasy about involving the eager rookie. During the ride to the hotel, Marty's excitement and relentless questions only add to Vito's concerns, especially when Joe accidentally reveals they're carrying explosives. The setup. Disguised as hotel maintenance staff, Vito and Joe make their way to the conference room on the 18th floor. They plant the bomb beneath the table, with Vito running the wiring out the window while they clean up a bloody accident at the request of Clemente's men. Their plan is interrupted when they encounter armed guards on the roof, forcing them into a firefight before they can connect the bomb. An early explosion. As they descend to complete the wiring, the bomb detonates prematurely, narrowly sparing them but failing to kill Clemente. The mob boss escapes the blast by being in the bathroom and flees, prompting Vito and Joe to pursue him through the building. A tragic loss. When they reach the parking garage, they discover Marty has been killed in the chaos. Heartbroken but determined, Joe and Vito jump into their car to chase Clemente through the city streets. Joe finishes the job by gunning Clemente down, avenging Marty with a torrent of bullets. The aftermath. Back at his apartment, Joe grieves Marty's death, drowning his sorrow in anger and alcohol. Later that night, Vito receives a call from the Lone Star Bar, where Joe has spiraled out of control. When Vito arrives to calm him, Joe's gun accidentally discharges, killing the bartender, Leon. Now furious, Vito takes charge, disposing of Leon's body and the evidence at Brewski's Scrap and Salvage, while ensuring Joe makes it home safely. Exhausted and frustrated, Vito finally returns to his apartment, reflecting on the cost of their actions. Vito Scaletta is surprised to find Henry Tomasino at his door, seeking a drink and a favor. Henry wants Vito to put in a good word for him with the Falcone family. As they drive to meet Eddie Scarpa at the Maltese Falcon, Henry hints at Vito and Joe's involvement in Clemente's demise, and jokingly advises better disguises in the future. At the Falcon, Eddie reveals tensions with the Vinci family and their disdain for Falcone's drug operations. When Vito suggests Henry for the family, Eddie asks if Henry has useful intel. Henry recalls overhearing Luca Guarino conspiring with Leo Galante to turn Vinci against Falcone. Eddie decides that Leo must be eliminated and tasks Henry with the job. Vito, refusing to betray Leo, rushes to warn him instead. Saving Leo, Vito finds Leo at home in his pajamas, confused and unaware of the danger. With urgency, Vito gets Leo out and drives him to the train station. Grateful but resigned, Leo speaks of retiring far away to escape the escalating violence. Back home, Vito encounters his sister Francesca, distressed over her husband, Eric, who drinks, cheats, and hits her. Despite her plea for restraint, Vito confronts Eric at a party. A fight ensues, but Vito spares Eric's life, warning him to change his ways or face worse. While Francesca later reports that Eric apologized, she becomes furious at Vito's threats, severing ties with him, losing everything. That night, the O'Neill gang sets Vito's house ablaze in retaliation for the death of their former leader in prison. Barely escaping with his life, Vito flees to Joe Barbaro's apartment. Joe quickly organizes payback, leading the pair to the gang's hideout at the Hill of Tara. They wipe out the gang, but Mickey Desmond, their new leader, escapes. After a tense chase, Vito and Joe finish the job, starting over. Left with nothing, Vito seeks refuge with Joe, who offers him Marty's old apartment. The dilapidated space leaves Vito despondent, realizing how far he's fallen. Despite Joe's reassurances about rebuilding, Vito can't shake the weight of his losses. Henry Tomasino invites Vito Scaletta to Lincoln Park to discuss a high-stakes business opportunity. Henry reveals that Carlo Falcone had Clemente killed to dominate Empire Bay's drug trade. With Frank Vinci as Carlo's next target, Henry sees an opening for them to make money by entering the heroin trade. A kilo costs $3,500, with a potential profit of $7,500 per kilo if sold directly to suppliers. Henry proposed buying 10 kilos for $35,000, promising a lucrative $75,000 payday. Vito hesitates, wary of the risks, but Henry and Joe persuade him to join the deal. Securing the money, the trio approaches Bruno Levine, a notorious loan shark with ties to the commission, to borrow the $35,000. Bruno deems the loan high risk and demands an additional $20,000 in repayment by Friday, with a penalty of $10,000 per week for late payment. Despite the steep terms, Henry agrees, and the three secure the money. They head to the Sea Gift fishing cowers in Chinatown, where Jae-Yun Wong of the Triads supplies the heroin. The deal proceeds without issue until they're confronted by a group of men posing as police officers. Henry sees through their ruse, and a violent gunfight ensues, leaving the imposters dead. As they leave the warehouse, they're ambushed again, resulting in a high-speed chase through Empire Bay. After shaking off their pursuers, they safely transport the heroin to Evergreen Street and Hunters Point. Profitable sales. The trio spends the afternoon selling the heroin across Empire Bay, raking in profits. Buoyed by their success, they decide to cap off the day with a night of celebration, momentarily basking in the promise of wealth. Vito Scaletta and Joe Barbaro receive an urgent call from Henry Tomasino, who reveals that Carlo Falcone has discovered their drug operation and is demanding a $60,000 cut. This demand leaves them far short of the money needed to repay Bruno. Henry arranges to meet them in Lincoln Park to discuss their next steps. When Vito and Joe arrive, they are horrified to find the Empire Bay Triads butchering Henry with meat cleavers. Though they manage to kill his attackers in a furious gunfight, Henry succumbs to his gruesome injuries. Adding to the chaos, the money Henry was carrying is missing, and they spot Jae-Yun Wong fleeing the scene. A vengeful assault. Vito and Joe follow Wong to the Red Dragon restaurant in Chinatown, seeking answers and vengeance. Storming the establishment, they gun down everyone in their path, fighting through waves of resistance until they corner Wong in his office. Under interrogation, Wong drops a shocking claim. Henry was allegedly a federal informant, working with the Bureau of Narcotics and leaking information about their drug deal. He denies involvement with the fake cops at the warehouse and refuses to disclose the money's whereabouts, saying it would mean his death regardless. Joe, consumed by rage, shoots Wong before Vito can get more answers, leaving them in an even worse predicament, fleeing the scene. With Wong dead, Vito and Joe escape the now police-infested Chinatown. Returning to Joe's apartment, they reflect grimly on their dire circumstances. Henry is dead, Bruno's money is gone, and their violent rampage may spark a war between the Falcone family and the Tongs. Though they agree to prioritize finding the money, Joe, needing a drink, ends the night, leaving Vito to contemplate their worsening odds. Vito Scaletta and Joe Barbaro, desperate for cash to repay Bruno Levine, take a hit contract arranged by Eddie Scarpa. The target, Tommy Angelo, a former mobster turned federal informant. Driving to Greenfield, they deliver the chilling message. Mr. Salieri sends his regards, before Joe kills Tommy with a shotgun. As anticipated, Tommy was under federal protection, sparking a chaotic escape as police and federal agents pursue them. Splitting up to raise more money, Vito goes to the dock seeking work from Derek Pappalardo. There, he learns Frank Vinci has commandeered Derek's men for a meeting with other mob bosses. Derek, left short-handed, asks Vito to break up a dock workers' strike. During the confrontation, an old dock worker recognizes Vito as Antonio Scaletta's son and accuses Derek of killing his father. Tension escalates until Derek's right-hand man, Steve Coyne, confesses to drowning Antonio on Derek's orders. Enraged, Vito kills Derek, Steve, and their guards. In Derek's office, Vito finds a stash of cash, which he takes, while the dock workers vow to keep his name out of the incident. Trouble brewing. Returning to the search for Joe, Vito visits Eddie, who questions him about Henry Tomasino's drug deal and massacre in Chinatown. Eddie explains that Carlo Falcone allowed Henry to pay a fine for dealing drugs, but that the Tongs double-crossed and killed him. The resulting violence has the triads threatening Frank Vinci, setting the stage for a full-scale mob war. Vito denies any involvement, keeping Eddie in the dark. Vito learns from Giuseppe that Vinci's men have taken Joe to meet Frank Vinci. Tracking them to the Mona Lisa bar, Vito is ambushed, knocked unconscious, and brought to the Midtown construction site. There, Vinci interrogates a beaten Joe and Vito, demanding answers about the triad conflict. The two refuse to talk, seizing an opportunity to escape. In a daring fight, they overpower Vinci's men and flee the site, settling debts. With Joe injured, Vito takes him to El Greco for medical help. Leaving Joe in his care, Vito heads to Bruno Levine's office to repay the loan. Bruno expresses surprise that Vito managed to gather the money, given Henry's death and the chaos that followed. Before Vito leaves, Bruno reveals he was the one who lent money to Vito's father, eventually forcing his mother and sister to pay it back, a bitter reminder of the Scaletta family's struggles. In the stillness of his apartment, Vito Scaletta sifts through old photo albums, haunted by the weight of his choices. Dreams of wealth, respect, and freedom had long since turned to nightmares of betrayal, bloodshed, and fear. The recent chaos, the betrayal, the murders, the looming threats from Falcone, Vinci, and the Chinese left Vito with a grim certainty. The endgame was near. Leo's grim ultimatum. The next morning, Vito is summoned to meet Carlo Falcone. Before he can leave, Leo Galante and Mr. Chu confront him. Leo, furious over the bloodbath involving the triads and Vinci's men, declares that Vito's actions have put everyone, including himself, in peril. Leo reveals that Henry Tomasino had indeed been a federal informant. His betrayal brought the feds onto Carlo, but Vito's involvement and past loyalties had worsened the fallout. Leo offers Vito one chance to redeem himself, kill Carlo Falcone that day, or face execution himself. A final betrayal. At the Zavesky Observatory, Vito faces Carlo's men, fighting his way to Falcone. Inside, Carlo tries to manipulate Vito, arguing that the mob's loyalty is a myth and hinting that Vito's own partner, Joe Barbaro, has betrayed him. Joe enters, pointing a gun at Vito. Carlo smugly orders Joe to kill him, citing Vito's role in Henry's treachery. For a tense moment, it seems Carlo's words are true, but Joe finally sides with Vito, turning on Carlo. Together, they gun down Falcone and his men. Wounded and defeated, Carlo taunts Vito one last time, claiming he was always a pawn. Vito responds with cold finality, shooting Carlo dead, parting ways. As they leave the observatory, Joe explains that Carlo had offered him power and a crew in exchange for Vito's life, but loyalty won out. When Vito asks why, Joe quips that Vito still owes him $5. Outside, Leo and Vinci's men await them. Joe is taken aback, but Vito reassures him everything will be fine. Leo confirms Carlo is dead and celebrates the end of Falcone's reign. As Leo and Vito drive off, Joe is led to another car, heading in a separate direction. On the ride, Vito realizes the truth. Joe was not part of Leo's deal. Though Leo congratulates Vito for doing what was necessary, the loss of his closest friend leaves Vito staring out at Empire Bay, knowing his life will never be the same.